session number 29, I think it is. Yeah. Mark 6:45 to 52. I've entitled it A Stroll on the Lake. Well, that means that you already know what is coming up. Again, one of the most well-known episodes in the New Testament. Christ strolled on the Sea of Galilee. As we asked last time, why bother if it's so well known? Why cover it again? Why not just skip it and go to some part that would be less well known? Well, now I can't assume that everyone has heard it. So if one has not heard it, this is your opportunity. There may be points that are not well known, even though you may have heard 25 sermons on this particular event. Review is always of value. You never lose anything in the review. It just helps you make better connections. And there are likely connections, as a matter of fact, that many haven't really seen before. So we're going to take a look at it. It'll take a bit, but not too long. First, we ask you to consider what is the point of Mark's narrative on Jesus' stroll. Why does he bother to tell us that Jesus walked on water? Well, part of that should be rather obvious. It's not an everyday event. So let's move on to the scripture account that comes from Mark. Mark 6, verse 45. And here's his word again, immediately, and this is immediately after gathering the 12 baskets of leftovers from the great lunch. It says, he, Jesus, made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him, which would mean, of course, without him, to the other side, to Bethsaida. And that presents some point that needs to be discussed. And he wanted to do that while he himself was sending the multitude away. So Jesus was getting the 12 out of there very quickly, apparently. Probably did not announce it. He just got them over there, got them in the boat, and said, go. And Mark says they were going to Bethsaida. On the other side. Other side of what? Well, recall that Bethsaida, there were two Bethsaidas. The one at which we think the great lunch took place was Bethsaida Julia. Julia was a daughter of the current emperor of Rome that apparently Antipas built or started, probably trying to put himself in the good graces of the emperor, the Caesar. It didn't work, as we have mentioned, that later he is exiled with Herodias. Bethsaida, again, two of them, right? We think they were at Bethsaida Julia, as I just said, which was on the east side of the Jordan River. In other words, they were in Perea. They were apparently out of Israel. And so evidently what Jesus was saying was, go to the other one that's on the other side of the Jordan, which would have been Peter and Andrew's hometown, according to Scripture. So, by the way, the 12 never made it to Bethsaida. And that's going to be an element in our current story. Why did they never make it to Bethsaida? Well, note that Mark gives us no description of the reaction or the response of the 5,000. They just got a free lunch, miraculously delivered from some small boy's little lunch that he carried with him for the day. He doesn't tell us anything about their reaction. John does, and we may look at that in a minute or two. But there are a couple of points that are likely connected with this into the narrative of the feeding. Why the haste to get the 12 out of there? Why did Jesus not go with them? I suspect that since they ended their fishing for profit days, that Jesus was always with them when they were in the boat going somewhere. I don't know that for a fact, of course, but every time we see them in Scripture, they're all in the boat together. Jesus never seems to be missing. But John, as I said a minute ago, John may give us some additional information that'll give us a clue. And I'm looking at chapter 6 of John, verses 13, 14, and 15. Goes something like this. And so they, that's the 12, gathered them up. The them are the scraps of food left over. Remember, Jesus says, pick it all up. We don't want any to go to waste. And they filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. So what he did, they gathered up 12 wicker baskets, and these were small baskets. They weren't large baskets. Small baskets that Jews, if they were going to be out all day, would take with them, with a little bit of food and a little bit of whatever else they might need. But here is, they started with one kid's lunch, which fit in one little wicker basket. Now, after feeding well over 5,000, they end up with 12 wicker baskets. So even that would have been a miracle, just to get enough for each of the apostles to have had a lunch. But we took in a few more than that. Verse 14, when therefore the people saw the sign which he had performed, and remember, John uses the word that we normally call miracle. He calls them signs because they're pointing to something of who he is and why he is here. When the people saw that, and they know that this was a miracle, they said, this is of a truth the prophet. What prophet? It's the prophet who is to come in the world. Those words were spoken by Moses, and they know that that prophet that Moses was speaking about was the Messiah. And the Messiah was to end up being the king. Jesus, therefore, this is verse 15, perceiving that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself alone. I have a little problem of how he would get in the mountain alone, because, out of 5,000 people, there were bound to be many of them who would like to stuck around and see where he's going, what he's doing, what else he might do. that is of a miraculous nature. But nevertheless, what he did was told these people to go home, which would be back to Caesarea and that region, of course. And he went up on a mountainside by himself. Now, it says well, this translation says the mountain, but other translations say a mountain, because there were many, we'd call them in the West tall hills, but there were many tall hills they counted as mountains, that Jesus would have picked one of them and gone up on them. He wasn't even actually that far from the Mount of Transfiguration that will come up a bit later. So, what was the situation at that time? This was a crisis point in which the crowd would have moved Jesus off the Father's path, because Jesus had to go through the cross to provide a solution to man's sin. But if they made him king, then he would have done it in the earthly manner, not what God had in mind. So Jesus had to get the 12 out of there so that they don't get, we already know they wanted Jesus to take over Israel immediately too. So I would suspect he didn't want them sensing the crowd's desire to make him king. So he got them out of there, and it gives us a sense of urgency because it says he made them go. He didn't say they just went. Jesus made them go. And the dismissing of the crowd, again, that would have been quite a chore. I've got 5,000 plus, and he just performed a miracle. They stuffed their bellies with the results and outcome of his miracle. They had just certainly witnessed more or moved some. I'm going to get it untongue-tied. I'm going to back up. What they had just witnessed certainly moved some to stay around to Jesus to learn and experience more. But Jesus wanted no part of that. And after bidding them, that we don't know whether it's the 12 or the crowd, the 12 that he sent off in the boat and the 12 that he told to go home. After he bid farewell to whichever, he departed to the mountain to pray. It's interesting. I had not thought about it before, but this is one of 3 events in Mark where Jesus dismisses the crowd to be alone and pray as he and the 12 faced a crisis. One of those we've already looked at is back in, I'll get it in a minute, and Mark 1, I believe, he dismissed the first group. Now this group, and later in chapter 14, he will dismiss even 8 of the 11 at Gethsemane. He took only 3 with him into Gethsemane, certainly a point of crisis as well. Now, as we go on to verse 47, the 12 are in the boat on the lake and without the presence of Jesus. Remember, as far as we can tell, this would have been the first time they've been in a situation on the sea in a boat, and Jesus was not there. Do you remember what happened the first time they were there and Jesus was with them? He was sleeping in the back, and they came up with a great storm, and he took care of it. They should have learned something at that time. Apparently they have not. We'll continue. Mark 6:47 and 48. And when it was evening, the boat was in the midst of the sea. Now, I don't think this means the geometric center of the ocean, not the ocean, the Galilean Sea, but evidently they were not near shore either. They were out somewhere, and why did they go there? If they're going just a couple miles to Bethsaida, they should have just hung around the shore and gone in shallow water. And it said he, Jesus, was alone on the land. Jesus still on the land. It doesn't tell us whether he was on the beach or on the mountain. We're not told that. And verse 48, and seeing them, that be the 12, straining at the oars, for the wind was against them. So now they're in a storm without Jesus in the boat. No telling what was going on, and we're not told what was going on. It says this was at about the 4th watch of the night. He came to them walking on the sea. And here's a verse that we're going to have to look at a bit, because it says, and he intended to pass them by. I don't believe for a moment he intended to pass them by, but so we'll have to speak about that. There were several points there. Evening was the time between sunset and dark. The boat is apparently not hugging the shoreline, but is south a bit. How far, we don't know. Jesus is still on land, either on the shore or the mountainside. Evidently, it was not yet dark, because Jesus could see the 11 or the 12. Strangely, they had apparently hadn't gotten very far. If he could still see them, how far can you see? A mile? If you were up high, maybe? I don't know. But they couldn't have gotten very far. If that's the case, then this storm must have been something to behold. Jesus knew they were in a bind, because their straining implies a contrary sea, a sea that says, you ain't going that way. The wind evidently, it was a strong wind, to say the least, was in their face, and it stymied their progress. What am I saying? I'm saying you got a headwind that's extremely strong, your rowing's not going to get you much. But it's interesting. I don't know anybody makes anything of this. The wind held up the boat from any serious progress. The wind did not hold up Jesus' progress as he walked on the water. You ever think of that? They couldn't go anywhere, but he, by walking, could. Remember, this whole series started with them going over to Bethsaida, Julia, and the people running along the shore to get there first. Well, here's one where Jesus isn't running, he's walking. but he's going faster than the boat could go. So, now Jesus, knowing the plight of the 12, could have rebuked, you ever think of this? He could have rebuked the wind and let them go on their way. He didn't have to come from the mountain down and walk on water to get this to happen. He could have stopped it. Remember, he didn't even have to go to places where a person was dying and died to revive them. He didn't have to. He could do it from where he was, but he didn't. There's another lesson I think that's coming up. The Romans, by the way, we mentioned the fourth watch. The evening, starting with 6 o'clock in the afternoon or evening, whichever way you want to take that, from 6 o'clock to the next 6 o'clock, those 12 hours were broken into 4 groups of 3, 6 to 9, 9 to midnight, midnight to 3 a.m., and 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So we're somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. It's a time that I like to say doesn't exist. It's supposed to be sleeping. There's no reality during those hours. But in this case, there was. There were guys in a boat being blown away, evidently blown quite a way south, as it turns out, and away from their coastal destination at Bethsaida. They didn't even get close to Bethsaida. They were going south, not west. But the boat was already, and I'm reading this from Matthew 14:24, and I'll have to apologize for saying I'm going to use a term in here, excuse me, and I don't have any idea what its measure is. Matthew 14:24. But the boat was already many stadia away from the land. Translation, this thing was a long way south. Now, how much a stadia is, I'm sure I've looked it up before, but I can't tell you right now. So if you want to know, look it up. You have Google. Just take you a minute. There were many stadia away from the land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. So, our first assumption that the sea was contrary would be true, but it was the sea in the form of wind. So Jesus' stroll was just not a couple blocks in shallow water, as some would have you believe. And they're saying that there was just very shallow waters, so it appeared that he was walking on them, but he wasn't. He was walking in few inches of water. But this was, he was taking a fairly long walk in a storm and on deep water. Jesus' progress doesn't seem to have been slowed by the wind. He made it, got to where they were. And the part that I read says he intended to pass by them. There are any number of interpretations on the meaning of that phrase. There are some scholars that believe that it was Jesus in an Old Testament-like theophany rather than Jesus in person. That Jesus was not the Jesus born of Mary, but he was the second person of the Trinity as he would have been prior to his incarnation. But the one that I think makes most sense is that this phrase that he intended to pass by was somebody's eyewitness account of what he believed Jesus' intent to be meant. So, or that Jesus intended to go by seeing where he was walking, likely, and walking maybe toward the boat, but not right up against the boat. I don't really know. But it certainly doesn't make any sense that Jesus would step onto the water, walk to them in the middle of a fierce storm, only to walk on by. Why would he do that? I can't make any sense of it. Even Mark said he stepped onto the lake to go to them. So even Mark told us his purpose was to go to the 12. I'm going to read from Mark 6, verses 49 and 50. When they, the 12, saw him, Jesus, walking on the sea, they supposed that it was a ghost. It's the word for ghost was a verse that was a word rather that implied fantasy in some sense. They didn't think it was real, but his back scared them, I guess, enough. And they cried out. I don't know what they cried out, for they all saw him and were frightened. Do you remember the other time he was on the sea and they said, "Don't you care if we drown?" So he got up and said, "Shh," to the wind, and it died? They became more afraid at that moment than they had before they woke him up. They can't handle who he is, what innate power he has. And so they're still not caught on that he has power over creation. The creation he was the Father's agent for. Let me finish verse 50. But immediately, there's his words again. But immediately he spoke with them, "Take courage, it is I." Actually, what he said is, "Take courage, I am." It's in Hebrew, ego, ego, eimi, E-I-M-E, E-I-M-I. Ego, eimi, or ego, eimi, however you pronounce it. He essentially said, "Take courage, I am." And of course he was. And then he says, "Do not be afraid." Well, I've also going to go through that again. And then Jesus gets into the boat. In the last two verses we're going to look at, 51 and 52. And he, Jesus, got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped. They see it again. Only this time he doesn't speak to it. He simply gets with them, and his presence stops the waves. And they were greatly astonished. Translation, they're out of their minds. They couldn't understand this, for they had not gained any insight from the incidents of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. So, they saw Jesus climb into the boat. The wind dies immediately. They figure that has something to do with his presence, but they can't figure it out. Just as the time that he broke the wind when he spoke to it, they're simply out of their minds. Somebody, some scholar, some writer has said that time was more a time of awe than instruction. I'm not sure that they don't eventually get quite a bit of instruction from that, but at that time they were awestruck. Here I go with those words again. Apparently, the 12 still, and this is what the comment relative to the loaves mean, they still, after the feeding of the 5,000, still hadn't grasped the notion that Jesus is sovereign over his creation. That's still, they've seen the miracles, other miracles. They have even performed miracles. Remember, they had just come back from the mission they were on, and they healed people. They cast out demons, and they still don't get it. They see the feeding of the 5,000 from the kids' lunch, and they don't get it. And he said, you still don't get it. They were spiritually imperceptive, hardened hearts. And who else normally is spoken of about hard hearts? Pharisees and others outside their circle. What's missing? And there is something major missing from Mark's version of this event. I'm sure you all know and can give me the answer immediately. There's no mention of Peter's adventure on the water and his panic as it ended. Well, remember now, most people think that Mark got his words to write from Peter. So either Peter didn't want to brag or he didn't want to see his panic. I don't know. But Mark did not include that aspect of this event. Remember, Mark's got a streamlined narrative, kept down so you can get through it quickly. He wants you to see Jesus moving quickly, doing fantastic things, all on the way to the cross. Remember, a third of Mark, about 5 chapters, are devoted to Jesus' last week of life. So we've done about a third, a little more than a third. We will wind up with doing the third on the Passion Week of Jesus. Now we've got another third in the middle to deal with. Next time, it's going to be a relatively short session probably, because there's a 3 or 4 verse summary that Mark gives prior to moving on into chapter 7. So we'll take a brief look at that summary and rehash what's happened in this chunk of Mark, and then we'll move into chapter 7, and that's a section where Jesus now ministers outside Israel. Tyre, Sidon, Decapolis, Perea. So we're going to move out of Israel for the most part. We may pass through it going from north to south, but we're not going to spend much time there. We're going to get rid of chapter 6